The title of this presentation is Ancient Wisdom and the Problem of Evil in Three of the Greatest Novels of All Time. I would describe my presentation as a lesson in comparative literature. I will be comparing the works of these three authors, one Russian, Fyodor Dostoevsky, and two French authors, Voltaire and Albert Camus. Those works are the brothers Karamazov, Candide, and The Plague. Here is a timeline to provide you with some historical context. Note that each author is from a different century. I need to unpack this title a bit, but first let's look at a definition of comparative literature. Comparative literature is an interdisciplinary field of study that analyzes literature across national borders, cultural contexts, languages, and historical periods. It examines literary works in relation to other arts and disciplines, including philosophy, history, and social sciences. The field explores how different traditions influence each other and how concepts like genre and theme evolve across cultures. These three novels lend themselves quite well to an exercise in comparative literature for two major reasons related to philosophy and theme. First, as it happens, each author was strongly influenced by a different source of ancient wisdom. Second, the three novels all share a common central theme, the problem of evil. The problem of evil is a fairly common theme. For example, here is an article I came across not long ago in the New York Times. It is an essay in the comparative literature genre. Ms. Mathis compares the works of four authors, one from the last century and three from this century. As her title suggests, evil and suffering go hand in hand. My goal is to explore what each novel reveals about its author's philosophical views and how those views influenced each author's approach to the problem of evil. Now you might raise a question, are these really three of the greatest novels of all time? That partly depends, of course, on who you ask. Here is an article from Forbes magazine, 101 Famous Authors and Greatest Writers of All Time. Of course, no two such lists are exactly the same. There's a lot of subjectivity involved. But this article is recent, updated in August of 2025, and perhaps it would be interesting to see where our authors fall on this list. Dostoevsky came in at number 8, Albert Camus at number 45, and Voltaire at number 49. To help me present some of the relevant material, I have enlisted the services of a virtual assistant narrator.
Hello, I'm Scarlett. Although Jeff wrote and recorded character descriptions and plot summaries himself, he used some online software to transform his voice into mine. In addition, there will be some places where you will hear direct quotes from the novels. In most of those cases, Jeff has inserted excerpts from audiobook recordings.
So here's our old friend William Shakespeare. His play Hamlet happens to be a great way to lead us into our discussion. As you may know, Hamlet has a problem. We could say that it's the problem of evil. His uncle has murdered his father. Something is rotten in the kingdom of Denmark. The problem of evil and how to deal with it torments Hamlet throughout the entire play. The problem of evil has been around since humans first appeared on Earth. There are two aspects to the problem. First, why does evil exist? And second, how should one respond to it? For our purposes today, let's think about evil in the broadest sense, anything that causes human suffering. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, evil in this broad sense can be divided into two categories. First, there is moral evil, evil deeds committed by humans, things like murder, torture, and all the rest. Second, natural evils, things like hurricanes, fires, earthquakes, and plagues. Over the centuries, humans have frequently tried to explain evil in terms of their various religious beliefs. So, for example, natural evils might be viewed as punishment from God for the disobedience of the people. Unsatisfied with these explanations, some philosophers have questioned why God, if he is all-powerful and all-good, would allow evil to exist. In other words, why would he allow human suffering? Leibniz was one of those philosophers who struggled mightily with the problem of evil, and we will come back to him in just a moment. But first, let's consider the flip side of the problem of evil. If the problem of evil equals the problem of human suffering, we can ask the following question. What can we do to alleviate or counterbalance suffering? Another closely related question is, what are the keys to happiness or to a good life? To help us ponder these questions, I'm going to share some ancient wisdom with you. During the time of the Roman Empire, there were three recipes for happiness and a good life that stood out above all others: two philosophies and one new religion. Epicureanism and Stoicism are the two philosophies. They originated in ancient Greece. Added to those, we have Christianity and Christian ethics. We will be exploring the influence of Epicureanism on Voltaire's Candide, Stoicism on Camus' The Plague, and Christian ethics on Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. The founder of Epicureanism was an ancient Greek philosopher named Epicurus. He knew that if you want to come up with a recipe for happiness, you need to define happiness. For an Epicurean, happiness equals tranquility and peace of mind. This definition led Epicurus to the following principles. Pleasure is the highest good. However, physical pleasure should be pursued only in moderation. Overindulgence in physical pleasure is typically associated with lust, greed, gluttony, and drunkenness, which are incompatible with good health and peace of mind. Intellectual pleasure is the best kind. His second major principle was that pain and suffering are bad, so they should be avoided as much as possible. It follows, therefore, that one should avoid conflict. An Epicurean would have little interest in getting involved in politics. There's just too much conflict there. Also, Epicurus would say, when you come across people you find disagreeable, practice tolerance and respect towards them, or avoid them altogether. Epicureans are peace lovers. Superstition is bad. This is a very important point. Why is superstition bad? Because superstition creates irrational fears of evil supernatural forces or beings. A true Epicurean will always advocate for a scientific, rational approach to understanding the world. one should refrain from immoral behavior. Why? Not because you fear punishment by the gods, but in order to avoid conflict with your neighbor. Consider 3 of the 10 commandments. Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery. That's just plain good practical advice, even if you are not religious, if you want to avoid conflict. The Epicurean ideal can be stated as follows: to surround oneself with good friends in a peaceful, pleasant environment, removed from the turmoil and evils of city life, and to enjoy a simple, self-sufficient life filled with simple pleasures. With all of this in mind, we can turn our attention to Candide. As an introduction to Candide, we come back now to Leibniz. In his philosophy, Leibniz admitted that God created a world with evil in it, but he maintained that our world is the best of all possible worlds because God would not create anything less than the best. His conclusion was that some amount of evil is necessary, even in the best of all possible worlds. As he put it, it may happen that an evil is accompanied by a greater good, and an imperfection in the part may be required for a perfection in the whole. Well, Voltaire didn't buy that argument, and in Candide he uses humor and satire to poke fun at Leibniz's philosophy. Candide is a young man who has grown up in the castle of a German baron alongside the Princess Cunigande. The best word to use in describing Candide is ingenuous, with all of its many connotations. Naive, innocent, overly trusting, gullible, honest, guileless, and of course, candid. Candide and the princess are tutored by Professor Pangloss. He is a disciple of Leibniz, and he teaches them that they live in the best of all possible worlds.
Pangloss was professor of metaphysico-theologico-cosmologology. He proved admirably that there is no effect without a cause, and that in this best of all possible worlds, the Baron's castle was the most magnificent of castles, and his lady the best of all possible baronesses. It is demonstrable, said he, that things cannot be otherwise than as they are, for all being created for an end, all is necessarily for the best end. Observe that the nose has been formed to bear spectacles. Thus we have spectacles.
Early on in the story, just as a forbidden romance is starting to develop between Candide and Cunigande, war breaks out between Germany and France, and the 3 main characters suddenly find themselves refugees fleeing from the atrocities of war. But Candide's adventures are just beginning, as he finds himself constantly on the run, narrowly escaping one dangerous predicament after another. In fact, the book is a travelogue of human misery, suffering, evil, and tragedy. In the course of his journeys, Candide witnesses mass killings, rape, torture, natural disasters, and plague. However, as Voltaire tells it, the story is filled with black humor, irony, and absurd situations, all mixed together in a simmering stew of satire.
I want to give you one example, but first a little bit of historical background. The auto de fe. Auto de fes were part of the Spanish Inquisition.
Auto de fes were formal public Catholic ceremonies that took place during the Spanish Inquisition. Heretics, especially Jews and Muslims who would not convert to Catholicism, were rounded up and burned at the stake in large numbers, while the remaining citizens watched and were called upon to repent for their own sins.
The local church leader in charge of the auto da fe was known as the Grand Inquisitor. A fictional Grand Inquisitor figures prominently not only in Candide, but also in the brothers Karamazov. Also, the Lisbon earthquake of 1755 was a dramatic and traumatic historical event for Western Europeans.
The Lisbon earthquake occurred on All Saints' Day in 1755, while most of the people were attending Mass. The earthquake, along with the resulting tsunami and fire, killed as many as 60,000 people. What happened next made the tragedy even worse. The local religious authorities declared that the earthquake was a punishment by God for the sins of the people, and declared the need for an auto da fe.
Back to our story. Candide and Pangloss happened to arrive in Portugal at the time of the famous Lisbon earthquake, after almost drowning at sea.
After the earthquake had destroyed 3/4 of Lisbon, the sages of that country could think of no means more effectual to prevent utter ruin than to give the people a beautiful auto da fe. For it had been decided by the University of Coimbra that the burning of a few people alive by a slow fire and with great ceremony is an infallible secret to hinder the earth from quaking.
Accordingly, heretics were rounded up.
When spies overhear Pangloss yet again explaining his philosophy to Candide, they find his views inconsistent with Catholic teachings and report him to the Grand Inquisitor, who agrees that they must be heretics.
Candide and Pangloss were made to dress up in ridiculous costumes.
They marched in procession, thus habited, and heard a very pathetic sermon, followed by fine church music. Candide was whipped in cadence while they were singing. The Biscayan and the 2 men who had refused to eat bacon were burnt, and Pangloss was hanged, though that was not the custom. The same day there was another earthquake which made most dreadful havoc. Candide, terrified, amazed, desperate, all bloody, all palpitating, said to himself, "If this is the best of possible worlds, what then are the others?"
As it turns out, Pangloss survived the hanging, and in the end, after many other misadventures, all 3 main characters and a few other secondary characters, including another traveling philosopher named Martin, are reunited in Turkey, where they live on a small communal farm.
They are finally safe, but there is just one problem. They're bored. They find their new life boring. A small group of them go looking for advice.
In the neighborhood there lived a very famous dervish who was esteemed the best philosopher in all Turkey, and they went to consult him. Pangloss was the speaker. "Master," said he, "we come to beg you to tell why so strange an animal as man was made." "With what meddlest thou?" said the dervish. "Is it thy business?" "But, reverend father," said Candide, "there is horrible evil in this world." "What signifies it," said the dervish, "whether there be evil or good? When his highness sends a ship to Egypt, does he trouble his head whether the mice on board are at their ease or not?" "What then must we do?" said Pangloss. "Hold your tongue," answered the dervish. I was in hopes, said Pangloss, that I should reason with you a little about causes and effects, about the best of possible worlds, the origin of evil, the nature of the soul, and the pre-established harmony. At these words, the dervish shut the door in their faces. During this conversation, the news was spread that 2 viziers and the mufti had been strangled at Constantinople, and that several of their friends had been impaled. This catastrophe made a great noise for some hours. Pangloss, Candide, and Martin, returning to the little farm, saw a good old man taking the fresh air at his door under an orange bower. Pangloss, who was as inquisitive as he was argumentative, asked the old man what was the name of the strangled mufti. "I do not know," answered the worthy man, "and I have not known the name of any mufti, nor of any vizier. I am entirely ignorant of the event you mention. I presume, in general, that they who meddle with the administration of public affairs die, sometimes miserably, and that they deserve it. But I never trouble my head about what is transacting at Constantinople. I content myself with sending there for sale the fruits of the garden which I cultivate."
The old man invites these strangers in and offers them delicious fruits, candied nuts, and Turkish coffee. Impressed by this spread, Pangloss supposes that the old man must have a large estate with many laborers working for him. "No," he says,
"I have only 20 acres," replied the old man. "I and my children cultivate them. Our labor preserves us from 3 great evils."
And what, according to the old man, are the 3 great evils that humans can escape through hard work? Poverty, vice, and boredom. Inspired by the old man's wisdom, Candide and his companions throw themselves into the task of developing a prosperous farm.
"Let us work," said Martin, "without disputing. It is the only way to render life tolerable." The whole little society entered into this laudable design according to their different abilities. Their little plot of land produced plentiful crops.
In the end, Candide and his friends are all reasonably happy. Pangloss once more tries to assert that despite their many ordeals, everything is after all for the best. "That is very well," says Candide, "but let us cultivate our garden." Does this ending to Candide bring to mind the Epicurean ideal?
According to legend, Epicurus is said to have bought a house with a garden outside of ancient Athens, away from that city's hustle and bustle and contentious political squabbles. The garden of Epicurus thus became a symbol for the quiet, simple life advocated by the Epicurean school. So, when Candide says, "Let us cultivate our garden," Voltaire is directly alluding to the Epicurean ideal.
With this understanding of the history of Epicureanism in mind, it becomes easy to see its influence on Voltaire, who spent the last 20 years of his life at his quiet country estate outside a small town near Lake Geneva. During that time, he frequently entertained visiting scholars and philosophers. He was a peace lover. He was an advocate for religious tolerance. He was an advocate for freedom of speech and freedom of thought. As a philosopher of the Enlightenment, he hoped that reason would triumph over superstition. Like Epicurus, he saw superstition as a major source of suffering. We now come to Christian ethics. Compassion. neighborly love, and a willingness to forgive. Jesus emphasized these principles in his Sermon on the Mount.
You have heard that it was said, "You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy." But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek as well.
This brings us to the brothers Karamazov.
The main characters are the three Karamazov brothers: Alyosha, the monk, who has a strong faith in God and is a sensitive and caring soul; Ivan, the intellectual, who is tormented by the problem of evil and all the senseless suffering in the world; and Dmitri, who is the impulsive, emotional one. He has money problems, women problems, and he sometimes drinks too much. The story centers around the murder of the father of the three brothers, and thus entails both a murder mystery and a subsequent courtroom drama. Above all, it is an extended exposition of how each brother grapples with human suffering in his own way.
It is an extraordinarily rich and complex tale. However, we are just going to focus on one profoundly moving episode that makes up the chapter entitled The Grand Inquisitor.
Ivan, the atheist, and Alyosha, the devout monk, have a close relationship built on mutual respect, for each one recognizes that the other's very different worldview nevertheless represents a sincere response to human suffering, to which both are profoundly sensitive. At one point, Ivan shares with Alyosha a story that he has made up. He calls it a poem, which is set in Spain at the time of the Spanish Inquisition.
In the poem, Jesus is not too happy about this whole idea of burning people at the stake, and so he comes down to earth, to a town in Spain, Seville, where an auto da fe was taking place.
In his boundless mercy, he passes once more among men in that same human form in which for 3 years he walked among men 15 centuries earlier. He comes down to the hot streets and squares of the southern town in which only the previous day, in a resplendent auto da fe, in the presence of the king, the court, the knights, the cardinals, and the loveliest ladies of the court, in the presence of the numerous population of all Seville, there had been burned by the Cardinal Grand Inquisitor very nearly a good 100 heretics, all in one go, ad maiorem gloriam Dei. He has appeared quietly, unostentatiously, and yet, strange this, everyone recognizes him. That could have been one of the best bits in my poem. I mean, the question of why it is that everyone recognizes him. The people rush towards him with invincible force, surround him, mass around him, follow him. Saying nothing, he passes among them with a quiet smile of infinite compassion.
The Grand Inquisitor promptly recognizes that Jesus is a rival for the people's respect and a threat to his own authority. He has Jesus arrested and imprisoned. He sentences Jesus to be burned at the stake on the following morning. That night, the Grand Inquisitor visits Jesus in his cell and undertakes a lengthy monologue in defense of the Inquisition and explaining why he has condemned Jesus. The Inquisitor's basic argument is this: Jesus made people miserable by expecting too much of them.
You desired that man's love should be free, that he should follow you freely, enticed and captivated by you. Henceforth, in place of the old firm law, Man was himself to decide with a free heart what is good and what is evil, with only your image before him to guide him. But surely you never dreamed that he would at last reject and call into question even your image and your truth, were he to be oppressed by so terrible a burden as freedom of choice. They will exclaim at last that the truth is not in you, for it would have been impossible to leave them in more confusion and torment than you did when you left them so many worries and unsolvable problems. Thus, you yourself laid the foundation for the destruction of your own kingdom, and no one else should be blamed for it.
What were the worries and unsolvable problems that Jesus left his followers with, according to the Grand Inquisitor? Remember that in his Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said,
You have heard that it was said, You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you.
But is it really possible to love one's enemy? Is it always possible to respond to evil with compassion and forgiveness? Elsewhere, Jesus said,
Again, I tell you, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God.
When the disciples heard this, they were greatly astonished, and asked, Who then can be saved? Jesus looked at them and said,
With man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible.
Statements like these leave a lot of room for interpretation and argument. The Grand Inquisitor argues that the Catholic Church has solved these problems by interpreting the Bible for the people.
It is perhaps fair to say that much of church dogma and tradition cannot be found explicitly stated in the Bible. The Grand Inquisitor is suggesting that by filling in those gaps and telling the people exactly what to believe and how exactly to be good Christians, the Church relieves the people of those uncertainties and anxieties. Otherwise, the argument goes, society would lapse into turmoil and people would be continually arguing with each other. Christians would find themselves fighting not only with Jews and Muslims, but also with other Christians. In fact, bitterly disputed controversies go back to the earliest days of the Church. Even Paul the Apostle found himself engaging in openly hostile rivalries with other church fathers and missionaries in the struggle to establish a single set of beliefs.
In order to convince everyone to follow the same set of beliefs, the Grand Inquisitor believes it is sometimes necessary to burn heretics at the stake.
The Grand Inquisitor is essentially arguing that it is necessary to take away people's freedom, specifically their freedom of thought, in order to allow them lasting happiness during their lifetime.
Now here's the surprising ending of the poem. Jesus has been silent the entire time, and when the Grand Inquisitor finally finishes his long speech, he is just a bit afraid of how Jesus might respond. However, Jesus says nothing, but simply walks over and kisses the old man gently on the lips. The old man is startled. Then after a moment, he opens the cell door, letting Jesus escape, while telling him to go and never come back.
During Ivan's recounting of his poem, Alyosha becomes increasingly agitated. Finally, he interrupts Ivan and protests that the poem is not a fair portrayal of either Jesus or of the Catholic Church. In truth, Ivan's poem is clearly meant as a criticism of organized religion. But then Jesus' kiss at the end is ambiguous. Is Jesus forgiving the Grand Inquisitor? Realizing that Alyosha is upset, Ivan asks his brother, Are you offended by the poem? Alyosha quietly kisses Ivan on the lips. Greatly relieved, Ivan says, "That's plagiarism. You stole that from my poem. But I thank you for it."
To me, the Grand Inquisitor is ultimately a parable about forgiveness and mutual respect. This is not to say that forgiving someone is always possible, but Alyosha and Ivan are able to maintain an affectionate, brotherly relationship only because each is willing to respect the other's point of view. In the end, Alyosha stands out as the hero of the story. He is someone who cares deeply about others. Despite being surrounded by evil and suffering, he never despairs. He remains true to his faith. What we learn, I think, is that for Dostoevsky, who considered himself a Christian, religion is not so much about beliefs, it's about attitudes and behavior, being respectful, compassionate, and willing to forgive.
The book ends with Alyosha speaking to a group of children from impoverished families, to whom he has served as a mentor and a guardian. He tells them, "Let us be, first of all, kind, and then honest, and finally, let us never forget one another."
And in response, the boys all cheered Alyosha. Finally, we come to Stoicism. Here, virtue is the highest good. Remember, for an Epicurean, pleasure is the highest good. For a Stoic, pleasure is not bad in and of itself, but it is not as important as virtue. Virtue, of course, includes things like integrity, duty, courage. Suffering is unavoidable. A Stoic would say that an Epicurean's efforts always to avoid suffering are futile. Therefore, the Epicurean philosophy is insufficient. Instead, a Stoic would argue that suffering should be accepted and endured without self-pity. Perhaps the most famous of the Stoic philosophers also happened to be one of the greatest of the Roman emperors, Marcus Aurelius. A few of his more famous quotes will help further illustrate some of the Stoic ideals.
Reject your sense of injury, and the injury itself disappears. Life is short. The fruit of this life is a good character and acts for the common good. No man can escape his fate. The only question is how best to live the time that he has to live. Stay calm and serene, regardless of what life throws at you.
And now we are ready to talk about The Plague. The novel is set in the Algerian town of Oran in the 1940s. As the story opens, the main character, Dr. Rieu, witnesses, over a matter of days, thousands of rats dying mysteriously and ominously in the streets of the town.
Soon thereafter, he is called to see a patient sick with fever and large, extremely painful abscesses in the groin and armpit regions. Almost immediately, he is called to see another patient with the same illness, and then another and another. They all die within days, and there are reports of multiple other cases throughout the city. Dr. Rieu is among the first to realize that an epidemic of bubonic plague is sweeping through the town. In the setting of this novel, before the advent of antibiotics, there was no effective treatment, and the disease was almost always fatal. Those large painful abscesses were called buboes by medieval doctors, hence the name bubonic plague.
As fears of the epidemic were peaking, the townspeople crowded into church one Sunday to hear a sermon from Father Panelou, a well-known local Jesuit priest. No doubt they were anxious to hear words of comfort and reassurance. Instead, Father Panelou delivered a dire warning.
Today the plague has its sights on you. The just have no reason to fear it, but the wicked should tremble. See him, this angel of plague, handsome as Lucifer, and brilliant as evil himself, standing over your roofs, the right hand raising the red spear level with his head, the left hand pointing to one of your houses. You believed it was good enough to visit God on Sunday and to have the rest of your days free. Tired of waiting for your arrival, God has allowed this scourge to be visited upon you, as it has been visited upon all the cities of sin since the beginning of human history.
Despite his harsh condemnation of sinners for bringing the plague to Oran, Father Panelou later shows his compassionate side by volunteering in the hospitals to help care for the sick. After witnessing the suffering and death of several innocent children, he admits that sometimes it is simply not possible to understand God's will.
Despite the serious risks to his own health, Dr. Rieu is steadfast and undaunted in making his daily rounds to attend to the suffering patients and to do what little he can to comfort them. His dedication to his profession seems to be a simple matter of fact. He does not openly espouse any strong religious principles, nor does he harbor any false pride in his powers as a healer. Moreover, he doesn't seem to expect any special recognition for his efforts.
Finally, after many months and thousands of deaths, the plague runs its course and comes to an end. The people take to the streets to celebrate.
They rejoice while fireworks are set off in the harbor and skyrockets explode with bursts of color above the town. But Camus won't let the story end without one final bit of commentary from Dr. Rieu, which expresses an almost fatalistic acceptance of the inevitability of human suffering, but also a spirit of hope, courage, and compassion.
And it was in the midst of shouts rolling against the terrace wall in massive waves that waxed in volume and duration, while cataracts of colored fire fell thicker through the darkness, that Dr. Rieu resolved to compile this chronicle, so that he should not be one of those who hold their peace, but should bear witness in favor of those plague-stricken people, so that some memorial of the injustice and outrage done them might endure. And to state quite simply, what we learn in time of pestilence, that there are more things to admire in men than to despise. Nonetheless, he knew that the tale he had to tell couldn't be one of a final victory. It could only be the record of what had to be done, and what assuredly would have to be done again in the never-ending fight against terror and its relentless onslaughts, despite their personal afflictions, by all who, while unable to be saints but refusing to bow down to pestilences, strive their utmost to be healers. And indeed, as he listened to the cries of joy rising from the town, Rieu remembered that such joy is always imperiled. He knew what those jubilant crowds did not know, but could have learned from books: that the plague bacillus never dies or disappears for good, that it can lie dormant for years and years in furniture and linen chests, that it bides its time in bedrooms, cellars, trunks, and bookshelves. And that perhaps the day would come when, for the bane and the enlightening of men, it would rouse up its rats again and send them forth to die in a happy city.
We can view Dr. Rieu as the embodiment of Stoic ideals. His devotion to his duty and his acceptance of his destiny, that is, of his assigned role as a physician, despite the dangers, is very reminiscent of the teachings of Stoic philosophers. Likewise is his ability to maintain self-control and not let his emotions overwhelm him in the midst of a terrifying epidemic.
Camus was introduced to Stoicism at an early age. When he was 17, he developed tuberculosis. He was told that he might have only 1 week to live. Seeking courage and comfort, he turned to the writings of the great Stoic philosopher Epictetus. When confronting adversity later in life, he found strength in the writings of none other than Marcus Aurelius. I will leave you with one final question. Is there ever anything to be gained through suffering? I posed this question to Google AI, and here is the answer I received. Suffering can lead to personal growth by developing resilience, compassion, and wisdom. It can provide a deeper understanding of oneself and the world, foster empathy for others, strengthen faith, and teach patience. Additionally, some view suffering as necessary to appreciate happiness, highlight true character, and gain a more realistic perspective on life.